Okay. Yeah, I just want to welcome everybody. Just a good morning and good afternoon. It's been a particularly eventful week for those that have been following the current challenges, West, Russia, Ukraine. And my name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow and director of democracy initiatives at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C. And I want to welcome everybody today to this important conversation after what we have seen is a week of intensive diplomacy between Russia, the Kremlin, and Western counterparts, starting first with bilateral talks with the United States earlier this week, then moving to the NATO-Russia Council, and then to the OSCE yesterday. We are really lucky today to have and to partner with RFE-RL and to have two outstanding journalists from RFE-RL, plus my colleague from GMF and also a professor at Catholic University, Michael Kimmage, to join us today to talk about what took place this week in terms of diplomatic efforts to address an escalating crisis that has seen Russia build up troops threatening Ukraine, and also really sort of expanding the conversation with NATO, with the West, about security and what has been the security architecture for almost the last 3 decades in Europe and in the transatlantic space. The German Marshall Fund has been focused deeply on this particular crisis, not only here, but through our offices in Europe. And so this will be one of many events and conversations that we'll be having on and off the record, focused on strategy and really what I think many people view as the most difficult and challenging security crisis we've seen in the transatlantic space since the end of the Cold War. So with that said, and I really want to turn quickly to our speakers, and we'll go down the line, and I'm not going to read their full bios because we have that online, but I'm going to turn first to Mark Krutov, who is a journalist in RFE-RL's Russian service, to talk first, looking at this week of diplomacy, looking at from the Kremlin's perspective, how does this week of diplomacy look like from Moscow? And this morning, many of us in Washington woke up and looked at our Twitter feed and saw a cyber attack, a massive cyber attack in Ukraine. And we're wondering, after listening to rhetoric yesterday, including from U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, saying, it looks like, things are potential. There's a great potential for escalation, for war. It doesn't sound like efforts to de-escalate and to box this into diplomacy or these different boxes to diplomacy, both bilateral, multilateral at NATO and OSCE, have really moved the needle on tamping down this current situation. But I wanted to get your thoughts, Mark, starting with you. What do things look like from Moscow on this Friday? What does it look like going ahead? And I think that's partially what we're here today to talk about as well, is what does the road look like ahead? Are we on the warpath? Is the war drum beating more loudly today than it was a week ago? Or are we just really in the same spot? But the chessboard and the pieces are just being moved. And so to get your thoughts on getting into the head of Mr. Putin and the Russian government, Mark, I wanted to turn it over to you. And I also didn't want to lose sight, as we talked about before this conversation, was about how Russians are viewing this current situation and their support or not, but the domestic political situation in Russia as well. I saw that the Russian, I believe it was the Russian stock market dropped precipitously this morning. And so there are economic consequences for instability. And so, what's the view look like from Moscow, Mark? And I'm going to turn it over to you. Then we'll go to Michael Kimmage, and then we'll go to Maryana Drach, who's with RFEL's a journalist who is a director of the Ukrainian service at RFERL. Maryana, thank you for joining as well. But Mark, let me turn it to you. And I just housekeeping before I leave. We're going to have a Q&A session after our three speakers give their opening statements. And so we'd ask those that are participating to pose their questions via Q&A. Again, this is on the record. We'll also have a video recording of today's conversation to share. Mark, over to you.
Hi, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to join you in this conversation today. So first of all, I should say there are still good news and bad news. And good news are Russia still didn't actually slam the door in negotiations. As we heard this morning from Sergei Lavrov, Moscow is still waiting for some answer from United States and NATO, while after yesterday's Sergei Ryabkov comments, his deputy, one would possibly think it's all over because, as you probably have heard, Ryabkov said that we don't see any sense, it doesn't make sense to continue negotiations. So Lavrov a little bit played down this morning, so this is good news. Technically, we are, as you said, at the same point. Bad news are that this door slamming is actually, I think, I'm afraid, a matter of time. It's clear what Russia demands. First and foremost, it's guarantees of no further NATO expansion eastwards. And this is simply what United States and allies not only can't provide, but can't even put on the negotiation table. So there were some hopes that Russian so-called draft treaties are just starting points of those negotiations, that they can be shaped, that they are deliberately rough, but and there were some hopes that it's possible to proceed dancing around INF treaty or military exercises scale in Central Europe. But unfortunately, everything I personally see shows that it's not the case here. Even worse news are that the local voices, first of all, of Russian prominent political figures and experts, as well as voices of experts in Europe, are getting closer and closer to the awareness of the fact that the Russian military buildup is not just a game of saber rattling or something like this. And unfortunately, it rather looks like a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, the scale of the buildup is that large. I'm afraid that Russia can't just pull back now. Putin fears he will be viewed as a coward or something. I'd be glad if time proves me wrong, though. But as for now, the situation is this. Why it makes sense here to say a few words about what happens on the ground, what we are at RFERL are following closely. I mean, this build up and everything around it. And also, I would like to say a few words about what experts say who follow this Russian build-up. So current build-up, current phase of build-up is nothing like what we have seen in spring 2021. This is the first thing I want to stress. Though spring 2021 build-up actually was just a part of the current one. It's qualitatively different. And I would like to make a small disclaimer. It's not only an observation of my own, rather what I get from interviewing many experts who closely follow up the build-up itself, following open sources like social media, satellite imagery, all that we can get our hands on. So a few more words about the build-up news from the ground. First, unlike what we have seen in spring 2021, Russia is trying to hide the movements. More movements happen at night. limiting open source capabilities. Like also Russia is purging military transporting trains from open source tracking services, which are being largely used in Russia for commercial purposes. We also see now that Russia is trying, for example, to paint over the tactical marks and etc. So these are quite worrying signs. Now, Russia builds up in terms of the whole armies. It does not only transfer this or that, they bring everything needed for a large-scale operation, including air defense systems like books that we have seen in Donbass in 2014. We saw them like months ago in the end of December. Short-range missile systems like those Iskander ballistic missiles, which are already based in Kaliningrad region. I should say here that they are indeed capable of carrying nuclear warheads, but we don't see any movement of such yet. That's a good sign. What we don't see yet is a massive deployment of the proper amount of personnel. Though in latest social media videos, we already start to observe it more and more often. At the same time, personnel deployment is something that can be achieved by Russia quite quickly in a week or so using military aviation. So that would not be a problem. That probably is left for the last stage. Now let's get back a little bit to what people in Russia say about all of this situation. And I should say that rhetorics we hear from officials, from MFA people to members of parliament, are quite belligerent and militant, and like they were never before. But there are some pro-Kremlin pundits, like, for example, I think I've read it this morning, Sergei Markov, who admits one important thing: Russia is not presenting its ultimatums from a position of strength this time. It lacks really real allies, and its elites are deeply integrated into the West, which is the main difference with the Soviet times and, for example, Caribbean crisis, which a lot of people recall now, because we already hear some rumors about Russia going to deploy nukes in Venezuela or Cuba again. So politicians, meanwhile, like head of the Russian parliament, Vyacheslav Volodin, and a lot of people like him are all in on blaming US and NATO on any possible escalation. And more rarely, they do blame Ukraine, but not because they think it's not Ukraine to blame. They just don't view Ukraine as an independent actor in this situation. So they don't count Ukraine as such. I can bring, I think, some sociology to this discussion, and I can cite Russian Levada Center's latest poll, and mind that Levada is far from having the pro-Kremlin bias. It's quite reliable and even have been designated as a foreign agent in Russia. So according to one of the latest Levada polls, it was middle of December, I think, results show that 75% of people don't exclude the war with Ukraine, while exactly the half thinks that US and NATO are ones to be blamed here, and plus 16% say Ukraine is to blame. And mind that it was 2014, 7 years ago, 8 years ago already, when last relatively large protests against the war with Ukraine happened in Moscow. So nothing like that happened since then, unfortunately or fortunately. In the end, let me say a few things about possible scenarios of escalation, which we are talking about here, and which I think should be mentioned among most real, if we are really to face an escalation. Experts I spoke with are stopping short before saying massive land invasion is likely. If it will happen, though, much more difficult will be, it's possible at all. It will be much more difficult for Russia to occupy any significant territories and hold them. That's a very important point, because a lot of people talk about invasion, And I'm really not sure that invasion technically is what we are going to face in the worst case scenario. I will explain why. You need a lot of people for that, really a lot. Well, now Russia amassed troops which are to be fulfilled with, like, I think 50 to 100,000 personnel to be fully operative and ready. You need at least, experts say, like 350,000 to conduct, say, Kiev occupation or Dnipro occupation. And mind that unlike Donbass or Crimea, Russia will have to deal with much less loyal population there. And we know that Russia did several operations in the course of the last 7 years, Syria, Crimea again, Donbass, but none of these were large-scale operations. Crimea was a quick and rapid special operation. In Syria, as well as in Donbass, Russia heavily relies on locals who fought with, who use weapons provided by Russia. But we can't say that Russia have an experience of large-scale operations conducted by its own. What is more likely, in my and those experts' opinion, are two things. Some escalation in Donbass, probably maybe resulting in some extraterritorial gains or building up some casus belli and then wiping out Ukrainian military capabilities with massive missile and or airstrikes. Then retracting and leaving Ukraine with army which will be even less powerful and weaker than it was before 2014. And we know that since then, Ukrainian military made a good progress. I also should know that the fact of massive Russian troops presence near the border is a great everyday push on Ukrainian economy and politics itself. And what experts said to me is that Russia can, in theory, keep those troops amassed near the border nearly indefinitely with some rotations. So the last question which arises here is what United States and its allies can do with that, actually. And it depends on what strategy Russia will finally choose. We don't know. But in my humble opinion, which corresponds to what I read and hear from relevant specialists, it's not about manpads or javelins or something like that, or even Bayraktars. Equipment is not really, this kind of equipment is not really very effective against massive missile or airstrikes. And anti-missile and air defense systems are, of course, not on the table for several reasons. Also, it will take too much time to train people and put those systems in service. So what I think may really help, and we see some signs that United States and NATO understands that, are secured communications equipment, intelligence information, satellite imagery, access to quality satellite imagery, and so on. So these things can help very much. Yes, Russia has its points when it speaks about possible hostile buildup near its borders, but as we see, resolving this problem or limiting short and middle-range strike missiles is not something that can change the big game. Ukraine will always be where it is. With or without NATO, it's unlikely to become less hostile state to Russia, which is the only way possible after Crimea annexation and 2014-2015 war in the east of Ukraine. So I think what is happening is Putin understanding that time works against him. The more time passes, the stronger is Ukraine and the more irreversible the situation is. And as you may have already understood, I'm pessimistic about possible outcomes of this situation. But of course, well, we'll see ourselves soon whether I'm right or wrong.
Hey, Mark, I had, sort of listening to you speak, and thank you for covering so much important ground. And you started to get into the head of the Kremlin and Putin right now, which I think is sort of the parlor game for everybody to figure out, well, what's behind this. And the domestic situation in Russia has, their increased repression, closing space for civil society, political opponents, media. RFERL has been also caught in the crosshairs sort of independent media and the ability to provide, transparent and sort of non-Kremlin talking points, just, at least to give Russians an alternative perspective. With that space closing, I wanted to ask how much of Putin's actions do you think and others feel is directly connected to his interest in keeping power, in looking ahead at the next round of, the next election, and how important is it to keep these issues on the table? Because if you look at the conversations that happened this week, in the bilateral discussions, the multilateral discussions, human rights internally in Russia, including with Memorial being closed down effectively. It's a very serious situation, reminiscent of years ago and getting worse. So it's hard not to draw to the conclusion that Putin's actions are meant to also distract from the internal political situation and his desire to even ever expand control. And then also in the context of what you said, where are Russians getting their information from right now? And I could ask you too, if you're seeing an uptick in RFERL's, viewerships and those that are reading what you guys are saying, and how can they get a perspective, because the actions of the government are not without consequences. And that's this whole week is about, the potential for real serious consequences. So I wanted to ask you that question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Yeah, you're right, exactly. They come on not only for RFERL journalists, but for all independent journalists and civil society. And yes, I think it's connected, because the authorities and Putin himself, they feel that during last years, they managed to build quite a solid support around these ideas. And it's also connected to the military situation, because we know that recent legislation provides criminal responsibility for investigating nearly everything which is connected with military or intelligence or anything, any sensitive questions. So that's also why a lot of people flee Russia, or those who didn't flee, they serve their prison terms or awaiting the trial. So yes, that's a huge problem, and there are less and less sources of independent, reliable information in Russia. Even those media who managed to work with this foreign agent label in this crackdown situation, even they sometimes try to impose a kind of internal censorship and not touch most sensitive questions related to military or intelligence.
I mean, Mark, does Putin view it? I thought the biggest victory that Putin's had in all of this has been the ability to remove this. You didn't hear Navalny's name raised, at least as far as I can see. You didn't hear, you're not hearing these concerns in a very, and I don't know, it just seems that this, for a lot of the international community, including the West, these issues have been on the table, these concerns, and now they're off.
Yeah, but the transit of power, which you spoke about in 2024, maybe my opinion is not will not be is one of unpopular ones, but I'm not thinking that the problem of power transition in 2024 is the thing which really drives Putin to hurry up with this military buildup and these ultimatums now. I think there are several options for him, including for staying in power himself. In 2024, so he has a bunch of options to choose from.
Thank you, Mark.
What may drive him, actually, for example, one of the things is is a shift to green energy in Europe, because as you probably know, Russia is highly reliable on gas and oil export. And as we know, in 2035, 2040, Europe is supposed to finish its shift to green energy and drastically lower the amount of Russian resources which Europe imports.
The energy issue is certainly part of this conversation, even in Washington, where the Senate was voting on amendments related to Nord Stream 2. So there's sort of multiple ends to this that are really particularly important, including the U.S. relationship with Germany, Germany's and European energy needs, and soaring energy prices. I want to bring in Michael Kimmage, my colleague, GMF colleague. Thank you, Michael, for being here. It's been quite a week for the White House for the U.S. negotiator Wendy Sherman, and hearing from the U.S. a couple of things this week. That they obviously went into this with a diplomatic strategy in mind. And then at the end of the week, you start to hear some of the statements coming out from the White House, Jake Sullivan. How are we to interpret this week? And I wanted to, I think the administration has done an extraordinary job in a way, sort of almost revitalizing that transatlantic relationship, something that President Biden spoke about last year at the Munich Security Conference, where he said we need to revitalize it to be the cornerstone of security, and that we're going to do it with you. And so we keep hearing this mantra this whole entire week about, nothing about Europe's security without Europe, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine at the table as well. Maybe speak to what you're hearing in terms of how the White House, the Biden administration is viewing what took place this week. Maybe, some of the more starker, I think less optimistic than sort of a Lavrov opening or statement on, what comes next. And of course, they wake up this morning and there's a cybersecurity attack. And not to say that it's been decided, maybe it has been since we've been on, who's responsible for it. So what is the perspective of, if you're sitting in the White House today, after this week, understanding this is not a 1 week issue. It hasn't been. Mark, thank you for pointing out the military buildup has been ongoing since, for quite some time. Also, military action has been ongoing since 2014, Crimea, Donbass. So this isn't something that hasn't been happening. It's been an active, hot conflict for quite some time. So what's the perspective from Washington? And then if you start to look at your crystal ball looking ahead, where does the White House want to take this, and where do allies and partners want to go? And so, Michael, you have an easy question to answer. It's sort of the $1 million question for those who are watching this in Washington, about sort of policy. And then Maryana, don't worry, I'm going to turn to you, because I think the Ukrainian perspective on all of this is so important. And I think you heard what Mark said, so I can't wait to get your response as well. So Michael, over to you first.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Jonathan. And it's great to be in this group discussion. I think the White House's objectives this past week were twofold. They were to hear the Russians out and to rally Europe, U.S. partners and allies, behind a single position. And I think that they did both of those things this week. They certainly got an earful from the Russians, and it was a good display of transatlantic unity, for sure, something that wouldn't have been possible or taken for granted 2 years ago. And that's definitely worth emphasizing. I don't think the White House came into this week expecting to persuade the Russians. I think that is a step too far, and it's sort of beyond the capacities of a lightning round of diplomacy. So, if they failed at that, I don't think they expected to succeed. So I think it's mission accomplished in the very short term. But to go a little bit deeper into your question, Jonathan, let me outline three challenges for the US, three challenges for the White House, and hopefully this will get us to the question that you really want to get at, which is where things may go from here. I think the first challenge for the White House is very much an internal matter, and this is to make accurate predictions about what's going to come. There's a sad dynamic in the US-Russian relationship where Russia seems to take us by surprise, right? Crimea came out of the blue. Donbass wasn't expected. Syria, the move into Syria, sort of took us by surprise. The election meddling 2016. I think that, the White House has to work very closely with its intelligence services, with Europeans, with the Five Eyes, sort of however they do it, to see if they can guess what Russia is up to. That's very difficult. Russia, of course, is going to try to obfuscate, and we live in a period of cyber war and disinformation. And it's going to be very, very difficult to cut through to the truth of the matter and to sort of plan accordingly. The Kremlin obviously is a black box when it comes to military planning, so it's going to be guesswork. But that's a very, very significant challenge. Where is Russia bluffing? Where is Russia faking? Where is it fainting? And where is it truly moving? That's, I think, the first and maybe most significant challenge in the next 2-3 months, assuming that we're going in the direction of a kinetic conflict, which I think is sort of to be taken for granted at this point, as Mark indicated. Secondly, although this week was successful and the Biden administration has lots of good instincts and they have very willing partners in the Europeans, the sanctions, or rather the alliance maintenance, is going to be a second challenge. It's going to be another challenge. And here I'd want to just focus a little bit on sanctions. So the message to Russia now is we're going to go much further than we went in 2014. What you saw in 2014 was a willingness to act on the part of the West, but not really to sacrifice. So the West was not going to use sanctions that really bit into the German economy or bit into the US economy or the European economy. Now that's going to happen. And I think European leaders have done a very poor job of preparing their publics for this eventuality. German chancellor is not out there saying it's going to be a tough 6 months. We're going to have to take a hit. The German auto industry may, sort of suffer a little bit from what we're going to do. And of course, Nord Stream can figure into that because that's what's going to make this sanctions package work. And so I think the White House needs to be out in front. They also need to signal to the American population that there could be some, difficulties that come from a tough sanctions regime. This is important, and it's going to be something to navigate. Let me fold one other point into this sort of second challenge of alliance maintenance. We live, as everybody knows, in a very polarized country. You have a little bit of space between the White House and the Senate at the moment, or between the White House and the Republican Party on sanctions. One wild card in this conflict, if it goes to a major kinetic, sort of war in Europe, is what's the position of Donald Trump going to be? Is he going to rally behind the White House? Is he going to support Joe Biden? Is he going to sort of rally around the flag? Or is he going to use this for partisan purposes? And I think we have to assume he's going to use it for partisan purposes. So the White House needs to think about how it's going to allow domestic politics in the US not to get in the way of its foreign policy. It's a regrettable point to make. It's unfortunate that we have that degree of division, but I don't think you can formulate foreign policy now and sort of not take that reality or that dynamic into account. So the White House needs to be working with the Europeans as closely as possible. It needs to be getting Republicans, those it can, on board with what it's going to do, and that's a sort of additional challenge. Third challenge, and here I'll conclude on this point, is very, very delicate and difficult. The White House will have to calibrate its kinetic response. National Security Advisor Sullivan has been clear. The U.S. is prepared to assist with an insurgency in Ukraine. There already is intelligence sharing between the U.S. and the Ukrainian government. There will be provision of arms, probably considerably beyond Javelin. So there will be a kinetic counter response from the United States and from the West. NATO will be a part of that. It will be European governments and the US government that jumps in there. But at the same time, if the US does that, tries to figure out how to push back against Russian military power, there's going to be a need to avoid unnecessary escalation. You really can't let this become a World War I in the making. You can't allow sort of NATO member states to really pour in. There was a question in the chat about this becoming a shooting war between the United States and Russia. I would just point out, as a historian of the Cold War, that never happened during the Cold War. You had any number of proxy wars where, Russian soldiers or Soviet soldiers and US soldiers, directed violence at each other in, Korea, Vietnam, a few other places, but you never had a shooting war directly in Europe, for the good reason is that could escalate to the nuclear level. So the Biden administration is going to have to figure out how to thread that needle, make a credible kinetic response, support the alliance, contain Russian military aggression, and at the same time not allow this to spill out of control. So that's, I think, the third, final, and maybe most dramatic challenge that the White House faces. Over and out, Jonathan.
Thank you, and I think you laid out a lot of the challenges, and also the sort of the overriding challenges too here in the United States. None of us mentioned COVID, economic issues, both in Europe and the United States, China as well, which has been a significant focus for the administration. And when you look at national security, you're not only looking at this particular one situation, but we're looking at multiple things globally, and global challenges. And you are right, the politics here is going to play a role, and that obviously can impact relationships with allies and partners. And I think on one hand, some people are arguing to give the administration flexibility, not to tie their hands, the Biden administration, as it relates to Nord Stream 2, and others are saying no, move forward quickly to shut that down if you can. So that's a raging debate here. I think you opened the door for sort of a number of sort of important questions, and the alliance maintenance. If you look even right now, Germany has a new government. You're hearing different messaging coming from different parts, even within Olaf Scholz's party, about issues like Nord Stream 2, or variations of the language, along with partners, Greens and others, and how they're approaching some of these issues. A French election that's going to be a potentially very close election that's taking place, and a number of other factors that separate the interests of East and West, both within NATO itself, and within the EU as well. So I think you really laid it out, and a lot that this administration is thinking about in terms of even what it looks like going forward. Maryana, can I turn to you? Ukraine is obviously at the center of what is taking place as well. You heard me say that the U.S. said nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. This has been a week that not only did NATO sit down with Russia, but also sat down with Ukrainian officials. There was a cyber attack today, and there's a number of issues on the table of importance to Ukrainians. And I wanted to just maybe speak to you, ask to get your thoughts on what's taking place, and how the Zelensky government is viewing the current situation in terms of this past week. Are they feeling like they have the support of partners and allies like the United States? What's happening internally? Is the escalation level, the concerns at the same levels that you're hearing from, for example, Jake Sullivan yesterday and Mike Carpenter, who's the U.S. ambassador to the OSCE? Maybe to get your thoughts on what's Kiev thinking. What are the next moves that you see coming in Ukraine? And it's sometimes when we're all talking about Ukraine's future, but we're not Ukrainian, we tend to lose what Ukrainians want, what they're seeking. And I think one of the important messages from the administration, from Secretary General Stoltenberg and others, has been NATO remains open, an open door, and that Ukraine will make a decision about its security and other relationships, and that should not be decided by Moscow or any other country. So Maryana, over to you. You got a lot to cover, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you, and hello to everybody. As you mentioned already, this morning, Ukrainians woke up to the news of cyber attacks on governmental websites. Be afraid and expect wars was the warning. The message reproduced the Ukrainian flag and map crossed out. And Russian hackers were immediately suspected. This is already a statement from one of the Ukrainian agencies, not a conclusion, but this is something to suspect. For instance, the text in Polish had clear grammatical mistakes. Ukrainian officials tried to calm down citizens, and for instance, the Secret Security Service stressed that there was no leak of personal information. And that news came right after high-level security talks. From the very beginning, Ukrainians had little faith in such negotiations. But now quite a few say that results are good for Ukraine, since parties kept their positions, their views, and there was no betrayal by the West. And Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, said that the week of high-level diplomacy was not successful for Russia. We spoke in Vienna yesterday with the Ukrainian representative to the OSCE, Yevgeny Tsimbaluk, and he was clearly optimistic and even claimed one more diplomatic victory. On the contrary, former Ukrainian foreign minister Pavlo Klimkin said that the fact of talks is beneficial to Russia. It's a tactical victory since Kremlin wants to be perceived as a great power. And we also spoke to the former Ukrainian ambassador to Washington, Valery Chaly, and he believes that the West would have achieved more if it demanded that Russia de-escalate first. But any talks are better than the war. And the main message of Ukraine now is to revive the Normandy 4 format, to continue negotiations. Amid warnings that there is the highest risk of war in Europe in 30 years, Ukrainians clearly want peace. They have lived in the state of hybrid war with real casualties for 8 years. And in his annual New Year's message, President Zelensky said that ending the war is the main goal of his government. And he expressed hope that 2022 will be better. At the same time, Ukraine has high expectations for NATO Madrid summit in June. It wants a concrete perspective with dates when Ukraine will become an equal member of the alliance. And the question to me is how to reconcile these goals when Russia made it very clear that it will not accept this geopolitical choice. A listener to our call-in show from Eastern Ukraine this week said that NATO is being hypocritical. Why do they say all the time the doors are open, but they're not more specific? And Ukraine, I would like to remind, did not have a consensus on NATO until 2014, but the annexation of Crimea and bloodshed in eastern Ukraine have changed that. And at that time, Ukraine had a status of a non-bloc state. Now, 59% of Ukrainians want to be in NATO. And they gave this answer in December, already after Russian troops amassed by the Ukrainian borders for the second time in 1 year. At the same time, Ukraine is getting ready for the worst scenario. Our correspondent traveled from northern border of Ukraine with Belarus to the capital. Not all shelters are ready. In some, you can find barber shops or no water. But the good thing is that the authorities are now conducting checks of such facilities. By tomorrow, every Ukrainian city is supposed to have a territorial defense unit. This is an effort of the Ukrainian authorities to engage former military and law enforcement in addition to civilians. Ukrainian women under 60 now must register with the military or face fines. They have time till the end of this year, while the regulation covers hundreds of professions, including journalists. Civil society members, after the fresh portion of threats, conducted social media campaign that Ukrainians will resist. And judging from the Christmas atmosphere in Kyiv, the situation there is calmer than it may appear from headlines in Western media. I apologize, I also have a cold as well as you. And I also have to say that Ukrainians are aware of internal threats. There is a fear that Russia will try to brew internal discord. The first case to watch is against the former president Petro Poroshenko. There is a bitter animosity between him and President Zelensky. Poroshenko is suspected of state treason for purchasing coal from war-torn regions. He rejects charges as politically motivated and plans to return to Ukraine on Monday. Our correspondent in Brussels yesterday spoke to him, and Poroshenko was defiant. He said that he is coming back to Ukraine to protect Ukraine from Russia. Last year, Ukraine indicted a top opposition figure with treason and attempts to steal natural resources from Crimea. Viktor Medvedchuk is a close ally of Russian President Putin. We covered his activities for years and broke the news that behind the anti-Western rhetoric, Medvedchuk's family had oil deals with the West. You can find this investigation on the OCCRP page. Medvedchuk belongs to the leadership of the largest opposition force in the parliament, and now after talks, they say that they have cautious optimism. And earlier, the Ukrainian opposition called to withdraw Ukrainian troops from borders with so-called republics in eastern Ukraine, in line with what Kremlin wants. And I did not mention Poroshenko and Medvedchuk by coincidence, because the Ukrainian government investigators today said that they do not exclude that they will cross-question two of them. We know the views of Poroshenko. He is a strong supporter of Euro-Atlantic integration, and Medvedchuk is close allies of Putin. To sum up, in Kyiv, in Ukraine, there is a fear of the new war. And at this moment, Ukrainians cannot breathe out.
On that note, thank you for sort of weighing into it. It's important to note, in every country, including Ukraine, there's these internal dynamics that are playing out, and some people look at the Poroshenko sort of targeting of him as taking maybe advantage of a situation where the focus is primarily on Ukraine's security situation, which is obviously sensitive and difficult, but maybe less so on the drive for democratic reforms or the type of actions that we're seeing. And it may or may not be that there's reason for somebody like Mr. Poroshenko to be held accountable, but you can't help but look at a situation in a country like Georgia, where you see political retribution internally as tearing apart the ability to govern, and that democratic reforms remain a critical component of Ukraine's resilience over the long term, and that you need to keep pushing in that direction. But thank you for sort of pointing both that out and sort of the issue of war footing and how that affects Ukrainians and what they are hoping to see, both in terms of the 59% that support, NATO membership, and the type of support that they would like to see from the West. One of the questions that we have in the Q&A, and we have a short time to answer some of these before we run out of time, is about military support for Ukraine. Back in 2014, it was clear that there was going to be no U.S., NATO boots on the ground when Crimea happened at fairly what would be lightning speed. And then in the Donbass, that has not meant that there hasn't been provisions of security assistance, defensive to Ukraine in that period. And I guess this would also go from Michael. Can you see one of the questions in any instance in which this, where the U.S. and NATO and other partners commit more significantly militarily, including potentially boots on the ground? And then I want to ask Maryana, whether or not there's any expectation that on the Ukrainian side that there would be that type of support, and if not, how does that factor into sort of the thinking in Kiev and amongst Ukrainians? So Michael, maybe go to you first. Sure. And Mark, if you want to weigh in, feel free to do so, but I think this might be directed at Michael and then Maryana.
I think not by design. I think that is not an outcome that the Biden administration would like to see. And I think President Biden, sort of before the diplomacy this week, made some pretty clear and emphatic statements. This is not, Ukraine is not an ally of the United States. It's not a formal military partner. The U.S. is not going to be involved militarily, but, wars bring with them their own momentum. We had reporting this week of the CIA training sort of possible insurgent forces for Ukraine, and one can imagine in the event of a wider war that sort of activity would increase. And we know from so many past precedents that you can sort of be in 1% at the beginning, and then there's a great push to be in 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%. So that's, I think, an entirely plausible scenario. Again, I think the White House wants to be cautious here, but they've also signaled that they're not going to be, aloof or indifferent or unconnected to what's happening. So a lot will depend on what happens on the ground.
Maryana? You're muted. You're on mute. Thank you.
We covered as journalists the essential moments, essential elements in Ukrainian readiness to defend itself, such as deployment of Turkish-supplied Bayraktar drones in Donbass, and the deployment of US-provided Javelin anti-tank missiles to war zone in the east. We prepare all the time reports from front lines, and I think that this technical support is essential. If you're asking me about boots on the ground, I don't think that this is something that the essential component that Ukrainians would be happy to see, but this is my subjective personal opinion. I think that definitely technical assistance, military assistance, trainings are very, very important.
Yeah, I would like to add, if I'm allowed, to that. Lavrov this morning made clear statement that any boots on the ground will be definite crossing of red line by United States. Though I think there are already something like 150 United States advisors in Ukraine. I'm not expecting these numbers significantly to change.
And Mark, that's not only sort of U.S., but there's other NATO.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, yeah. Not only US and the like, of course.
But Mark, one thing I want to ask you too, when I'm hearing Michael and Maryana talk to is, Michael, we didn't talk about the, obviously the U.S. withdrawal and that of NATO and partners from Afghanistan, signal what, on this end has been concerns about forever wars. And sort of the last 2 decades of the U.S. engaged in very significant combat, and also very costly financially and otherwise. Do you get a sense that the Kremlin feels like that this is that the U.S. won't do these things because of what's taken place this year? So what are they thinking when they think about these factors, and they seem to be very closely watching sort of U.S. politics and what's taking place? And I'm going to turn my next question. We'll get sort of more deeply into politics in the United States, but that factor, do they view the U.S. as being weak right now, militarily incapable right now? And is that the right, I guess you can't really answer this, but the right calculation or maybe a miscalculation?
I think, yes, they tend to think that the US is weak, especially after Afghanistan. But I don't know if they really pretend to look like thinking like that, or do they really understand that Afghanistan and Ukraine is quite different things. And withdrawing from Afghanistan, even in the manner it happened, doesn't mean anything about Ukraine actually. So yes, from what we can read and listen, yes, they pretend to show that United States is weak, but in my opinion, they perfectly understand that it's far from reality.
And if I may add,
Sure, go ahead.
If we are talking about any boots on the ground, despite the fact that we have about 100,000 Russian troops by the Ukrainian borders in Crimea, in the occupied Donbass, from Russia, we hear all the time that boots do not matter that much because Russian politicians are saying that they would like to repeat the Syrian scenario, so meaning airstrikes. And we know that the Ukrainian capabilities to defend itself from air are quite weak. We spoke with various experts and they acknowledge that this is an issue for the country. Ukrainian pilots did not get any new planes in 30 years and must modernize the Soviet-made gear. So if we are talking about boots on the ground, this is something to think of. And this is worrisome if we are speaking about possible, if we do not exclude the scenarios of targeted airstrikes.
Michael, I see you two-fingering. Come on in. Yeah, I'm glad, Maryana, that you mentioned Syria, because I think it's more relevant than Afghanistan. I think that one way, and it's not anything I say with any enthusiasm because it's awful to contemplate, but one way in which Russia could achieve a buffer zone in Ukraine without occupying the country is by turning it into a failed state. And actually precisely turning it into a zone of proxy war in the way that Syria has become. Russia's quite comfortable operating in that environment, and you could sort of achieve the Russian objective in that case without having to send in 350,000 soldiers and occupying the country and doing all of that. So I think the Syrian model is the most relevant one for what Russia may do in Ukraine.
Yeah, and certainly that's the case and has been used in a number of spaces. That's the these conflicts that sort of last forever and keep pushing in that direction until you achieve the objectives that you seek. Although I haven't seen that happen yet in Georgia or in Moldova or elsewhere. One thing I wanted to ask, we're going to stay a couple minutes extra because we're at the top of the hour. I hope that's okay for our speakers. Just 5 more minutes extra. Thank you. I did have a question, Michael, that came in the Q&A about the Nord Stream 2 issue and about the vote that took place. It's kind of insider baseball if you're watching, sort of trying to understand how the U.S. Senate works, and I'm happy to weigh into on this. But the question was about why were Republicans all voting in favor of sanctions and Democrats all voting against? And maybe you could just break that down a little bit, because that's really not what the vote that took place yesterday wasn't about. Those who favor sanctions, those who oppose it. I think it's pretty universal that everybody, there's almost universal belief that the Nord Stream 2 project is not desirable. Even the Biden administration says this as well and has repeatedly said this. But many have supported sanctions as well, have been strong supporters of sanctions on this. Maybe you could just slice through, give a quick reading sort of what took place in this vote. And I think I just want to dismiss the notion that Democrats aren't, I think they're pretty close on this, but there's some politics and other things that are behind this. So
politics and geopolitics, to take a quick step back, Nord Stream 2 has been, to go back to this topic of polarization, a bit of a partisan football. From the beginning of the Biden administration, Ted Cruz has used it to hold up all kinds of appointments, and I think that's really more for domestic political purposes. Then, of course, you had the shift in policy by the Biden administration over the summer about Nord Stream 2, which was in part about restoring good relations with Germany. I think that that's not so much in play at the moment. I think now what you have, looking at it in its sort of best light, is just a tactical difference between Democrats and Republicans. I think the Democratic argument at the moment is that if you sanction Germany for Nord Stream 2 now, before there's a sort of another turn in the story of war between Russia and Ukraine, you kind of diminish your leverage, sort of down the road. So let's sort of see what happens and see if the threat of turning off Nord Stream 2 is going to affect the Russian calculus. If Russia goes to war in a bigger way, then you use that as part of the sanctions package. I think that's the Democratic approach, and the Republicans are, in a sense, I think, trying to distinguish themselves from Democrats by taking a different tack on Nord Stream 2. But I think in the event of kinetic action in the short term, Democrats and Republicans will unify on this issue, and the ball will then be in Germany's court.
Yeah, well said on that, and the complexity too internally in Germany, how they have split positions on this, depending on political party or within party. So it's a challenging issue, but it's also of real concern to many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who have been concerned about the impact of the pipeline on Ukraine's security, energy security in Europe. And it's not only just Ukraine that's concerned about it. There's multiple countries within the EU, and then there are other countries on the other side who share and support Nord Stream 2's completion. So the EU has its own challenges thinking through this, including its own energy security. We're a little bit over the hour. We have about 3 minutes left. What I wanted to do is maybe to start going backwards, Maryana, just to get your final thoughts as you think about, as we've had this conversation today, and it was so great to have you join, of what, some final thoughts as we look ahead at what I think one of you said, this is, like strap yourself in. This is going to be and has been difficult for a while. The escalation is serious. It's the most serious security threat in Europe in 3 decades. And you have multiple other factors that Michael pointed out globally that are happening at the same exact time, that are really impacting, including here in the United States and domestically in a number of other countries, taking place that are going to impact what the policy and what things look like. So none of us can really predict the future, Maryana, but you're going to do your best at trying to walk us through from the Ukrainian perspective what this looks like going forward.
Coming back to Germany, I would like to stress that today we received news that the German foreign minister will be coming to Kyiv and then to Moscow. And the Ukrainian ambassador in Berlin, Andriy Melnik, he called the new German leadership to show political leadership regarding Russia. So I think that Ukraine will be focusing on Germany and will try to convince Germany to say goodbye to Nord Stream 2. This is in terms of diplomacy, which is important for Ukraine. But my short remarks are that Ukraine has to continue to work to better defend itself. And key asset of Ukraine would be the unity of the Western alliance.
Thank you. Michael, over to you.
I think that it's important to look a little bit beyond the headlines, which are very frightening and will be for a long time to come, and to build upon Maryana's comment about Western unity, to remind ourselves of the great strengths that the West has in this coming or new round of this conflict. Part of that is economic. So I think long-term economic statecraft holds great potential for achieving real results. Maybe not this summer, but 2-3 years from now, that's important to remember. And also the kind of basic decency of a lot of the Western positions. They may be difficult to defend. The tactics are not easy to figure out, but there's a lot of decency to the idea that countries can decide their fate, territorial integrity, sovereignty, all of that. So in a sense, to kind of stick to our guns and retain the long view of things, and to know that it will be difficult, but also to retain a certain sort of basic self-confidence. In that respect, going back to the very beginning of the conversation, I think the White House has done a good job, and I simply wish them success in that endeavor going forward.
Michael, thank you. Mark, for the final word.
Yeah, so I want to say, first of all, that no one of us should expect that we can just walk out of this situation and go back to square one. In some time, it definitely will develop further and further. In terms of possible scenarios, I would like to point that we should remember not maybe Syria or Crimea or Donbass. I recommend everybody to remember Georgia 2008. I think this is something which Putin and Russia looks at as a kind of a template of what can be happening in Ukraine. It's not occupation, it's not massive invasion. It may be some short but very effective operation, which will really hurt the Ukrainian military. And my point is that time is playing against Putin and against Russia, and he understands it perfectly, not only because of this energy shift or something, because as Maryana correctly said, Ukraine is feeling stronger and stronger in terms of military, and Russia is obviously not going to sit and watch how the situation becoming irreversible for them.
Mark, thank you for that last point. And the only thing I can think of is that when I hear you say that there's some sort of a vision for Russia, it makes me feel like there's not really much of a vision from Putin about Russia's place in a 21st century world that's shifting very quickly and holding on to pieces of the past rather than taking advantage of a Ukraine that's successful or a neighborhood that is economically and politically shifting. And so that's a bigger debate about what people view as their perspectives. But it's hard to think that a KGB agent that grew up in sort of the era that he did has a modern perspective on what Russia might look like sort of going forward, which is a bigger debate, a bigger conversation to have that I see, that especially with its own rivalry with China, even though there's cooperation, that you see China moving ahead in sort of a different way than Russia is economically, technologically. And we didn't bring that into this conversation, but unfortunately, and it's interesting enough, I think that you and Michael came pretty close in some areas on what the future might look like in terms of limited warfare or how this box might be played. I hope we can come back and have a wider conversation, Mark, with you to talk about Russia's future itself, internally, politically, and in terms of something that I think it was you said that a lot of the elite are outside, not inside, or that there is a movement, and including a lot of Russians who now no longer in Russia, but are set up along its periphery as well. So a lot to discuss. Thank you guys so much. This is a complex issue. One thing we all hope is that there is de-escalation, and maybe not many people are hoping that or believe that is going to happen in the current atmosphere. But the worst case scenarios aren't good for both either Ukraine, the West, Russia. And Michael said some things in war, some things are unpredictable on how it unfolds. And so hopefully we can come back. And I really want to thank RFERL, our partner in this conversation, and for, and having both Maryana and Mark for you joining, and then my colleague, Michael Kimmage in Washington. So on behalf of the German Marshall Fund in the United States, thank you so much. And we'll be sharing the video of this conversation, really important conversation later today. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Stay safe.
Thanks
for having us, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Thank you.